Welcome to the Audiation in the Wild podcast with your hosts, Bo Talifer and Eric Rasmussen.
All right, so Eric, today I thought we'd have a conversation about how we can navigate the non-MLT world. So the reason this was on my mind is I've often found that trying to describe the essence of music learning theory to parents of your students is actually in most cases quite easy, especially if they're not musicians.
By
But
far.
so this is interesting because often if they have had music lessons, they might be confused why the way we're doing things is a little different, or I've often found that they're quite open to it when they see that it works, actually. But there are other situations, where you have other colleagues, band teachers, teachers that you're going to be passing your students off to, even bosses, where so there's these other relationships where it can be a little difficult to navigate the conversation, especially if they don't kind of understand the tenets of MLT and what goes into it. So I thought that'd be an interesting conversation to have. I found myself in a lot of situations where you can end up getting in a conversation with someone really fast where they disagree with MLT without understanding it. And I think, I don't know if those situations with colleagues are the best place to start educating people on MLT, because in my experience, in real-time debates, people very rarely change their mind. You can have a cordial debate or disagreement with somebody, but often if they are going to change their mind, they're going to do it in the privacy of their own research and discovery, usually mid debate in front of the rest of your friends doesn't tend to change their opinion. I mean, that's been my experience with this.
It's tough. There are people that agree to avoid the conversation. Like there's people that can get into the conversation and like to argue, their point because they turned out okay. Right?
Sure.
And then there's music educators in general, like they just tend to teach how they were taught to teach, or worse, how they were taught. And if they weren't brought up in MLT, there's like it seems invalidating to them often, like how they learned. And that to me was the big aha. It's like now I felt that. I felt like now I know what was wrong, because it was like this inner sense that that I was missing out somewhere, somehow.
I totally agree. I think my experience, my aha was different than yours in some ways, but the way it was similar is that, I was learning music very quickly on my own. And whenever I had a teacher try to formally show me stuff using theory or whatever, I just didn't learn it as well. I could tell I wasn't audiating. I didn't have the word for it, but I knew it didn't have that kind of strength as when I learned something on my own. And that was one of the reasons why I didn't want to go to university right after high school, is because I was like, all my experiences, well, the vast majority of my experiences with teachers that were teaching theoretically and all that stuff, it didn't lead to better playing.
No.
Right? I did better on my own, just listening to recordings and just figuring out how to play stuff by ear, which, I had the ability to do that. But for me, the aha was like, I didn't want to just go to a random university. I wanted to make sure I knew who was teaching there first, because I could tell some teachers knew about this stuff and others didn't, even though I didn't have the whole framework online yet. So I think for me, it kind of slowed down my post-secondary study for sure.
Yeah, so I mentored teachers in Baltimore City for 15 years. And at the beginning, I was doing at least 20 hours in classrooms, going from classroom to classroom, school to school. And my intention was to give them a little bit of music learning theory, because that's what, for me, engaged the kids. And the kids are successful, it would answer a lot of the problems that most of the teachers had, which was classroom control, keeping the kids engaged, just trying to get through the day, not
Sure.
getting injured was a high priority
Sure. Yeah.
in some schools. Not bothering principals, staying in their lane, right? Or having overbearing principals. So there's so many other, safety or
Mhm.
bottom level. Uh,
Oh, Maslow's?
yeah, Maslow's hierarchy
I'm
of
thinking
needs.
Matt.
So they're
Oh,
so
yeah. Okay. Okay.
yeah. So they're dealing with the bottom rung and the top rung.
Sure.
Like the air conditioner doesn't work in their room.
Yeah.
Like
The
kids
basic,
come in and
safety
it's
and
just
shelter needs.
miserable. And so
Yep.
and just,
You brought up something really interesting in there that I want to touch on. I think a lot of the times there are classroom management skills that teachers should have, and I don't teach in large groups because I'm a one-on-one teacher, but I really acknowledge it's a skill set that you have to learn how to do. But I think often when students are not engaged or just downright causing issues in class, I think a lot of the times it's coming from they're being asked to do things that they can't do and they're not actually learning, because if people are learning and achieving,
and the opposite
they tend to
and the
calm down
opposite
quite easy.
doing stuff
Sure,
that's
and if they're
just
bored,
so yeah, it's just so banal. I'm going
yeah,
to do ta ta ti ti ta, and there's fourth
sure,
grade and they've been listening to complex hip hop rhythms and
I totally agree.
right.
Yeah,
So in many
but I think,
cases the teachers are overwhelmed by the either the lack of musicianship or the superior musicianship. And
yeah, and this is one of the difficulties that comes from not having classes where, and this isn't something that Gordon talked about in learning sequences in music. He talks about sprinkling the aptitude in in a seating arrangement where
yep,
you have someone high next to someone low in either rhythm or tonal. But ideally, if you have a curriculum worked out, whether it's for math or English, it's really hard to be efficient with curriculum design if the students aren't placed in homogeneous groups that have similar skill levels, because half of the lesson is going to go way over someone's head and be boring for someone else. That's really it's a hard thing to get across, um,
well,
and our public school
it
system
makes
isn't necessarily designed to deal with
one of
that.
the harder jobs on the planet to do well even harder, and the
Mhm.
onus is always on the person doing the most, which is usually the teacher in the classroom. They're not being
Sure.
supported regularly or appropriately, or if they are, they're being told exactly what they need to be doing. In fact, I had to resign from a job. I
Mhm.
think I mentioned in the previous podcast. They told me I needed to teach third grade curriculum to the children. I said, no, I teach the children the curriculum. I don't teach. I teach, right.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a huge distinction for me, because you're working with these individual minds in your classroom, and I recognize where they are even
Yeah.
without an aptitude measure at some their performance, right, their achievement. Um, and so you know where to
Mhm.
push hard and maybe not without having delivered one. But once you do, then you find the surprises, and that's
Yep.
where the surprises is 20-30% of your class at least.
Which is a lot.
And then so how do you
Yeah.
adapt that? And then how do you explain to the principal, or how do you explain, in your case, the parents, in my case, the parents. Um, and parents are very receptive to the idea that, hey, we talk to our kids, 95% of the day. The interactions they're having with you are through language. And what if we had 50-50? What if we had 60-40, whatever? What if it all
Mhm.
was music and you had to go to private English lessons, to learn,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Nobody wants that, of course, but there is this possibility of music being as entrenched as language is in the early, development of young brains, of course, early childhood, but when you're talking about public schools, there is a lack of vocabulary or a shared vocabulary. There is, principals are, maybe 20 to 30% of them are really advocates for music, and that might be a strong,
Sure.
high level.
And there's just a big split in how, in Canada here, and I'm in the Vancouver area. A lot of my elementary students have music from kindergarten to grade 3 or 4, and then there's a gap in grade 5 and 6. There's often no music, and then it goes into concert band. I don't know if
It
it's like that in the
it
States, but
varies.
so it's like in Canada. But then even the kids, like some of the kids in elementary school, have music every day because their teacher in their classroom is the music teacher. So they just do
Right.
they'll do bucket drumming for a month and then the ukulele for a month. So they're getting music every day. But then other kids only get it once a week, and that's a big. You times that by 5 years, that's a
Oh
big
yeah.
difference.
That it's astronomical. I know from my own experience, my Orchids program in West Baltimore, one of these El Sistema based, inspired, groups, where we're really going into places where we're, the purpose of a program like that is to have music be a component for bringing about, um, change, societal change.
Hmm.
Um, Beyond playing the music, you're trying to impact a whole number of factors, uh, in terms of a community. And so I, I found that twice a week. So I was teaching twice a week for 40, 45 minutes by the time the kids came in and I really got them settled, or the teacher stopped yelling at them and telling them they have to behave better than last week. And, once the teachers
Yeah.
got out, then I could go on about my business and just do music, just hammer music, until they just got used to what to expect when they came in. And when they saw how much they achieved, I think that made the biggest difference in terms of cooperation. And there were still a lot of kids who, behavioral issues up and down, people that are, that really needed to be in
Sure,
special,
sure.
classes, or maybe not even in a school. There were a few that were just so,
Yeah.
I had a kid hang out a third floor window once by his fingertips, not in the
Yeah.
school I was teaching, but I was there to support. So there's all kinds of stuff. So there's the
But there's no doubt that curriculum design and how that influences achievement and competence, it affects behavior in class. I mean, did I ever tell you the story? I had a kid at this music school that I was teaching at, and the owners of the school approached me and they said, "Okay, we got this. You're going to have this student this year. He's a piano student. Just kind of be careful. He's got a bit of a short fuse, and he threw a chair through a glass door, last year, and he gets violent when he gets frustrated." And so, day one of the lessons, he's using like the Bastion piano book, and I could just see him get really frustrated every time he made a mistake with the sheet music. Because I was like, "Oh, show me what you were working on last year, your teacher." I just got rid of the book and just started teaching him by ear. The kid had a crazy musical memory. It was so
yeah,
musical. Everything took off, and I never had a problem with him once. And people for years were saying like they used to dread going into class with this kid, but I don't really think it was anything that I did behaviorally. It was more I wasn't asking him to do things that he couldn't
yes,
do or that
yes,
frustrated him.
you're
But he
teaching the
he was still a
kids,
student.
the kid that's in front of you, not the kid you want them to be. It's like, oh no, you should fit this mold, and then I can teach you.
Which is the problem with designing a curriculum, is that if you try to say everyone has to be on exercise 1 before they move on to exercise 2, it's very inflexible in terms of it's hard to design a curriculum. I mean, a great example is like I have students. Again, we've talked about this. I don't do aptitude tests. I'd love to get into that, but I haven't done it. But I've had some students for 4 years now. I know some of them have high rhythm aptitude because their achievement's so high. Those ones, if we're playing guitar, I push the rhythm thing a little harder with them. I'll get more nitpicky about like, okay, let's swing this, let's not swing it. Like, oh, that
Yeah,
last microbeat was off. And what's interesting is I have good rapport with them, they don't
Yeah,
mind
no,
that.
no,
They don't
they
mind being pushed
all
like
kids
that.
want to learn. They get the beaten out of them by being asked to do things they shouldn't be asked to do, or given things that are just too easy. So,
This
and it
is
becomes a
so. This is one other. This is one other area that I've been thinking about. You know, in the public sphere right now, and personal development and teaching. You know, Angela Duckworth's book on grit has
mhm.
been tossed around a lot lately, and I really think this message of grit, in terms of like both grit and Carol Dweck's
Yep,
growth
yep,
mindset
yep.
ideas, they've gotten off the rails a little bit because it excuses teachers for making poor curriculum decisions. Like teachers can just badger students with things that they can't do, and then say, and then you try to coach your students into, well, you should have grit. Even though it's hard, you should keep doing it. And I generally believe in those values, but coaching students to have a growth mindset and to have grit, it should not be necessary for every single activity in class that they do. I think it's inappropriate. If students can't achieve the task, they're going to logically be unmotivated to do it, or bored, if they're bored by it.
Yep.
So I don't know. That's just
Yeah.
that's just a
So
hobby horse
yeah.
I've been riding for a couple of years.
So those considerations are almost more uh, more important at some level, right? And they become a barrier to even entering the conversation of, you know, you need to be doing tonal patterns and rhythm patterns and harmonic learning
Mm-hmm.
sequence with this kind of repertoire. Just I don't need the extra burden to really start working hard on my teaching, because whatever I got in college is what I'm going to apply, or whatever. And more likely than
Mm-hmm.
that is to want to do what your best music teacher did for you. So I was going to be a band director because he was the best musician I
Right.
had, uh, except for private lesson teaching. And, I was
Yeah.
already successful in how I was decoding at first and then putting things in my ear through reading theoretically. Once I got it in my
Yeah, and don't get
ear,
me wrong. I think there are better and worse ways to teach decoding. I think there are ways that work, like what Paul Harris does works quite
yeah,
well, but I think that's often not done.
yeah,
But anyway,
but
yeah.
yeah, but so there's these barriers to even having these kinds of conversations with colleagues, or when you're mentoring, or
Hmm.
principals. Like, what are the most difficult things you try to address, and how do you win somebody over to that music learning is really uh, developed so strongly inside music learning theory.
Hmm.
It's just to those of us on this side, it's really unquestionable. There's pieces I want to, I want to quibble with, and there's certain parts I want
Sure.
to overhaul. And I think I've done that with a harmonic learning sequence. There's, that needs to be considered. Um, and because I spent 15 years or 20 years on it, and
Sure.
it's turned into something that needs to be deemed a method that based in music learning
Yeah,
theory. it's
yeah.
it's really become codified to a large enough degree. um, but even when I play a video of my second graders doing the dominant of the submediant, and knowing four
Oh
or
yeah.
six tonalities, and being able to move freely in my BB big beats are not the same size meters. Like
Hmm.
that's the result of something that it teachers many times can't do any of that. So is that beating people over the head with a stick? Say, look at, or is there a way to introduce, like, what we should be pushing ourselves? And once you go into music learning theory, you can't
Oh
not
sure.
improve your own musicianship. It's crazy. You get. It's
I
like you have
mean,
a lesson for 6 hours a day for yourself, right?
that's what teach. I mean, once you start using MLT in the classroom, the teaching gets very interesting because you're always kind of tinkering, with something, but you're just model of how people learn music. And I think changes. And I think this is why, years ago when I got into, I've taught music, I'm 32, I've taught music for, since I was in high school, but really full time for the past 4 years, right? But and I've been into Gordon the same period of time, but it's just a basic question like how the hell do people learn music? And it's just interesting, there's a difference between people that study that question and that don't. And this is one of the areas where I think, having a discussion with somebody who disagrees with MLT that knows nothing about it is very different than having a discussion with someone who fully understands MLT but disagrees with it. And those are two
Yeah.
very different conversations. When I'm in the non-MLT community, I'm like the most vocal proponent of MLT. But within the MLT community, I very much enjoy trying to pick apart things I don't think make sense or that don't work. And that's part of the reason why, I like this podcast, because I think there are a few things that I would put a little asterisk next to in my head. But in general, it's a remarkable framework for anyone to have. And I mean, I think the music learning sequences in music, I think the testament to this what's gone into this is how it's impenetrable by people. You can't just read that book and understand what he's saying. Like, this is really a book that takes some study, and you need to have conversations with people about it. You're actually going to have to level up your thinking quite drastically to wrap your head around what he's saying. And I would think that that would be even harder for somebody who can't already improvise and has gone through the sequence. Because I think one of the reasons I think I did well, a few years ago when I got into Gordon, is a lot of these things were floating around in my head. I could improvise looking at people in like jazz band and concert band in high school, like, why can't they do that? What's going on? They're reading the sheet music, I'm reading the sheet music, but I can improvise. They can't play stuff by ear. So like a lot of this stuff was already on my mind, but I really do think it would be hard to read that book without actually knowing what it feels like to be on, at the end of the sequence for at least some basic
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah.
Um,
So you distinguish two populations. I had a boss at one
oh
point
yeah, yeah.
that called me into her office without having met me yet. Somebody got fired. She filled in, interim basis that eventually became the full time, uh, boss of of where I was teaching. And because I said that folk literature is limited in terms of the typical folk literature that kids know. So when I'm talking in early childhood context, like it's Spider and 25 or 30 other tunes, they're all in major. They're almost all
Mm-hmm.
duple. There are some that are triple. But what's the variety? There's just not enough variety there. So the fact that I said this in a parent handout, and she's got wind of the parent handout, and and she sat me down, and first time we met, she got red in the face and yelled at me. Where's the entry point for her
Sure.
for me to describe? And she was a huge ORF leader component or proponent. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
and where do you even start when somebody's yelling? So there's no opening for education.
Well, and this gets into some of the different value systems in, there are a lot of music learning theories or methods. Like, we have Gordon's theory, we have Suzuki, we have Kodai and Orff, and then just the jazz kind of cultural method. But I mean, from the Kodai and Orff tradition, the folk songs are
Yeah,
center in those traditions. So for you to tell them that, there's not enough in
yeah.
here,
There's
that's
contextually there's
that
not
goes
enough in here,
against
but
what.
on the other hand, in the last episode, I think, or before that, we talked about preserving some culture too. And so
Oh, and I think,
there's somewhere that needs to
yeah.
be included, that I think traditional music learning theory might be missing the boat in preserving culture if everything we're teaching doesn't have a fair amount of a body of literature that does come from the past, and but help poor is that relative to the contextual variety of music learning theory literature? But a lot of music learning theory literature people write, or these 100 experimental songs and chants, or book two of
Exactly.
those.
Yep.
I don't
Yep.
find but a few of those that are inspiring to me musically. They give me
I
ideas,
totally
and
agree.
I like some of them, but not as much
Hmm.
as the ones I've made to replace, what I would normally take from those. So that's one place I have a criticism. But that now we're going
Sure.
down.
Which is, I think that's a very fair criticism, and I just wanted to say one thing about
Mm-hmm.
that, like because I run into a similar situation where I teach one on one, which gives me a lot of license to just fly into a lesson blind. But like if I have a student who's a guitar player and they're really into classic rock, I try to find the stuff in there that's appropriate for where they are in the sequence and harmony and all
Mm-hmm.
that stuff. And if not, it's just listening exposure. But from doing this so much with students, like I have some students who just they get really into certain
Yeah.
artists, and I try to
Yeah.
support that. You just try to put the songs in front of them that give them variety. If someone likes this one student who's just been listening to tons of Ariana
Yeah.
Grande, and I try to okay, I got a major, I got a minor, and if I can't find another tonality, maybe I'll change the tonality of something that they're playing. But you can do this on the
Do
fly.
you talk to your students about this is why I'm doing this?
Like when
When
I'm
you do,
doing when I'm changing
yeah,
tonalities
when
and
you're, you know, I tell my teen students and a little bit younger a little bit of the differences
oh yeah, oh
differences.
yeah,
Listen, this is how you learn things. It's
oh
and I
yeah, oh
give them
yeah.
just
Once they're old
a
enough,
little
like
hint of just a wisp of music learning theory without talking. I don't usually even use the term audiation in my lessons.
so yeah, I don't use it too much. I mean, I just the only reason I don't use it that much is because I'm the only one using that word in that student's mind or in that student's life. But my teenage students, everyone knows we learn to sing things when we play them. We learn to audiate them in our mind. I
So
just say hear it in your
you
mind
don't
because I
have you don't need to you don't find yourself in conversations about no, I'm not doing that with students.
oh no, my students are fully
Yeah,
brainwashed. They
okay.
know. Yeah, and I tell them like if for any reason I can't be your music teacher anymore, the ones that I'm really close with, it's a handful of students, I say find someone who can improvise really well. That's the person
Yeah.
you want to take lessons with. And I just say, if you roll into a piano lesson, I'm fine with you, doing classical piano and decoding and all of this stuff, but if the person really can't improvise, I would kind of put a red flag on that person. And yeah, I think if you have a student for, years on end, you have a bit of responsibility to coach them into some
Yeah.
of those philosophies without talking down
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
people, of course, but I would just say if I had the choice, and you wanted to learn piano, I'd find the best jazz piano player in town that I could, and hopefully he can play some
And you're
Bach
saying
too.
that because they're
Probably be
beyond you, or right? You passing them on or up, or because they
no.
want.
I'm just saying if for any reason we couldn't continue
Okay.
lessons, yeah, I'm not
You,
worried about
yeah.
getting people up
Yeah.
there, but yeah, I just say that's what you look for in a teacher, and people that can figure out how to play stuff by ear. I don't mean transcribe. We've talked about this
Yeah.
before. I don't mean transcribe by writing things down. I just mean can they play a melody after hearing it on their instrument? If not, I'm kind of suspicious about signing someone up for lessons with
Yeah.
them.
Yeah.
Um,
So I talk to parents in my classrooms well, actually every week I do like a 30-second or even a minute long snippet of, what I want them to see about what we're experiencing together, like the kids, like
mhm.
the kid just staring. I want them to know that that's perfectly appropriate, doing nothing. And the parents that want to manipulate the kids' arms, and I throw these kinds of
Mhm.
conversations in, and they're really they're really receptive to these things. And part of it, I have a little ilk. um,
Mhm.
but the but conversations are almost avoided across the faculty where I work, and then you know,
Sure.
or when they are understood, it's like it's a little overwhelming. I think,
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, I think an important part of going into those conversations when you're talking to another teacher or a professor or anyone, that has an opinion about this, I just go into it. I enjoy these conversations a lot because I like to just ask questions, how do you think people learn music? What's going on? And I really am not invested in changing their mind in that conversation.
yeah,
It's not a goal that I have going into that conversation. Um, and I'm more skeptical about people's opinions that can't play very well. I mean, when we talk to Hal Galper and he's like, "Yeah, let's use pitch letter names," I have no issue with what he's saying because he's telling you to do everything else that I think matters more than the tonal solfege system. He's telling you to sing it. He's telling you to
yeah,
feel the groove. He's telling you to, learn the pieces from the culture. He's
and
telling you the
yeah,
things that
and
matter.
he's basically the kind of student he has is a student that needs deprogramming from the way they've learned to pay attention to the things that
Sure,
he's saying are missing, which are basically a lack
sure.
of audiation.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's just a lack of oral, I think more than anything. And not oral
Yeah,
as in we're going to split tonal patterns and rhythm patterns, but are you just listening to stuff and singing it
yeah,
back? Like I think a lot of the issues that go on even in concert band, like I mean, this is another small area where I have students who are in band at school and they're taking private lessons with me and they're usually taking guitar or piano with me but playing sax or something else in the band at school. And the lessons are radically different because I'm doing everything by rote and by ear, and then I will get into naming things and all that, that's fine, but I'm really not in a rush. I'm just trying to give them as much patterns and learning by rote and getting a handle of the instrument. And it usually surfaces after a couple of months, but they start realizing they don't like the way that they learn in concert
yeah,
band.
yeah,
I
yeah,
have no students that prefer
yeah.
it. And it's funny. I have a couple students who have concert band teachers that actually make them sing the melodies. So they'll be like, trumpet, sing the melody that you play, or anything like that. And I think you can get. I'm not saying you can get the total benefit of like a full blown MLT curriculum by just doing stuff like that, but man, the difference concert band who like the teacher gets you to sing stuff or sing the resting tones versus
Yeah,
not,
yeah.
holy smokes, like you will hear a difference
I
in
think
that band.
they hear a difference in the orchestra if you stop at letter A and say, "Okay, strings, sing the clarinet part." I do.
And that's another thing I talk about. How often can you sing someone else's part? I mean, even when I was in high school, I would sing like the main melodies and stuff, but man, like now when I learn something on the piano or the guitar, I'm trying to learn to sing the odd voices that are tucked in, behind things that you wouldn't normally learn.
Yeah, I'm
But
not saying I do that, but I imagine it. I think, I'm audiating
mhm.
at some imitation level or whatever. Or I'm just trying to sing along with something I haven't heard before. I'm singing out loud and I'm, you know, being creative inside whatever harmonic structure is going on. And it's like, okay, now I
Sure.
can fix that. Now I can, you hear where the things are, hear where you're off, where you're little
Yeah.
outside
But I
outside of.
do obviously I think it's important to be respectful about, teachers have the right to do what they want to do in the classroom and they often will just do it
But how do
anyway.
you approach?
But
What are some of the things you might say?
well, often I'll have this discussion with it's in my experience, it's more often a classical musician that kind of doesn't that won't play ball. It's not jazz teachers that are arguing listening to music. It's more so when I run into classical piano teachers traditionally. This is another very interesting part of this is that different instruments have different cultural norms around how we learn music. Guitar players often can improvise, and they often are encouraged to do it in lessons. Classical pianists are often not encouraged to do that beyond a certain degree. And so, a lot of the conversations I've been in are with classical teachers. But again, this is where it starts to get funny: is that I'm usually having this conversation with classical performers, not classical composers. It's very rare. Most of the great classical composers that I know and that I've worked with, they say things in their books like, you should learn to sing everything you play. You should learn it's all in there. It's baked in there. But it's mostly classical performers that are very notation driven and that are very, anti, like some of them go as far as like, never listen to a song before you attempt to sight read it, which to me makes no sense. I don't understand why that. I think the advice is given as an attempt to make your sight reading better, to kind of rely on it, make it some kind of rate limiting factor. But musically, it doesn't make a lot of sense. Like, why should students have to do that? And I think concert band, I don't know what goes on in a lot of concert bands apart from what I just hear, but not a lot of concert band teachers send their students home with just a boom recording of the whole thing. Hey, listen to this a couple times a week. It's here and there, but not all the time. So how do you navigate those conversations? I think first step is not be committed to changing their mind in that conversation, but often getting at the roots of why they can't improvise starts to pull up some stuff.
Yeah, I have I've had so many conversations in professional development. Like, I even went up to New York. I got invited to New York City, and I worked with 30 music teachers, and boy, did I present my stuff well. And I had a lot of handouts, so that they could capture a lot of what I was saying. And I, begged them to stay in touch if they wanted to work on this further, but I only had, 2 hours or whatever I had of their life to drop this bomb, and it was about teaching, reading. How do we go about teaching reading? Well, and the whole parallel to language development. But you just don't, other than the comments that you get immediately back on paper, you don't ever hear. They're, very interesting. He really knows his stuff.
Yeah, but are they applying it? For years.
I have no idea. I found his talk fascinating. And then there's a few other people that's like, this was a waste of time.
Sure.
You get that feedback.
One of the benefits,
you never find out what we're actually doing when we're steering people toward, learning some of the foundations from music learning theory practice.
Well, that's why I think coaching for teachers, or what you were doing where you're mentoring, is so important, because we know to get better at something, you have to do deliberate practice. You can't just wing it. People tend to not get better after a certain point. But we all know this in terms of our own musicianship. We all practice and do all this stuff. But, how often are we actually practicing becoming a better teacher? And I think the value of having someone watch your lesson, even though it can be quite nerve-wracking for the teacher, it can be very enlightening.
I beg people to come watch. I do. I've asked people come, as often as they like to, as long as it's workable. COVID put a damper on that a little bit, but to have extra people in the room, and the kids are distracted by strangers sometimes.
I think that is very much the case. Having someone sit in your lessons for some.
Anybody. It's like I amp up my level a little bit too. It's like it makes you, it makes things go by quicker. It's like all of a sudden,
well, it's a new situation, so there'll be some novelty in it.
Yeah, I wish I had more opportunities when I could get permission to really record classes and show people.
I think it'd be good for a lot of teachers to have more of that kind of
training.
There is
my video playlist. I'll put it in the show notes of some of what my kids do. specific. But how, you know, I really enjoy talking to parents. I enjoy teaching to kids even more. Um, you know, and the parents. And then it's the most difficult is to teach and work with music,
Yeah.
other music educators, especially if they're highly entrenched in either what they've been
Well, the
doing
problem,
or, you
like,
know, and I'm highly
yeah.
entrenched, so they could say the same about
Oh
me.
yeah, we're indoctrinated. Let's be real here. No, well, one of the problems though is if you have a teacher who's entrenched in another pedagogy or not, the learning curve involved in getting this really in your head properly, is high. I've never had someone who passionately disagrees with me, and I'm like, okay, buy a copy of Learning Sequences of Music, call me when you read it, and we'll talk about it. I've never
Yeah,
once
yeah.
have had that happen.
See, I
And
think that's a
it
form
just
of punishment because it's not so
it's not
it's
realistic.
not so accessible relative
Yeah.
to Eric Bluestein's book, which isn't necessarily comprehensive with regard to the theory,
Bluestein's book, what book is
the
that?
the ways children learn music.
Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe that'd be better to start with. My experience was learning sequences of music in the mail. Hey, what's this?
That's what
That was
yeah,
fun.
that's what you got. Um,
Yeah, I had no idea who Gordon was. So, one person mentioned a guy on a jazz guitar forum was like, "Hey, you should check out Edwin Gordon. Some of the stuff you're talking about sounds like his audiation concept." And then I just mentioned it to a friend of mine who's a drummer, and then he just mailed the book to me. He just bought it and mailed it. And so I didn't even know there was like a whole community of people that were doing all this. I thought it was just
yeah,
yeah.
I
So
emailed who did the world in 6 songs, uh,
I don't know.
and this is your brain on music. Daniel
Oh,
Levitin.
Levitt? Yeah.
Daniel Levitin. When
Yeah.
I read This Is Your Brain on Music and really thoroughly went through it, really enjoyed it. And I said, "You got to know who Dr. Gordon is." And he says, "Oh yeah,
Yeah.
blah, you know, this, that, and the other thing, you know." And
Hmm.
but it's not cited in the book at all. There's no
Mm,
citation. There's no even mention. And
hmm.
to me, that, you know, a little bit of a lack of integrity. But I still recommend uh, getting you know, well-rounded. That's a couple a couple of books that really help give you a different perspective of, you know, the how music has grown, you know,
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
humanity and how it might have developed, and they're really good books to think on. But um, you know, that was a short email conversation.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
you do
Parent,
find
there's another.
people that understand, or at least the basics of music learning theory, or so he said, but yeah, is not a
Yeah.
proponent of it because he should be at least putting it in the index or something.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. I mean, that's interesting. I didn't know that. Um, one of the groups of people that have been the most supportive over for me teaching like the MLT kind of way are parents who had taken music lessons as a kid and stopped and now have seen what their kids can do without starting with notation. A couple of one of my parents has bought a bunch of Gordon's book because she was just like, how is this even possible? But that's very motivating and that feels nice. And um, yeah, I think that's a get a lot of support from parents once they get buy-in.
yeah, it's an interesting conversation to have about what we can do to make ourselves available to people who could be interested. This podcast might eventually
Hmm.
leak out into some more of the general population of music educators.
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem with this podcast, even though you're listening to it right now, is you kind of need to understand MLT to listen to this
Yeah.
podcast, right? So there's a bit of a barrier to entry
If you missed
there.
the last
But
episode, by the way, if you let me uh, amp this up a little bit. If you would please share this podcast with other music teachers and let me know that you've done that. I want to give everybody the opportunity to get my book for half of what it's been. So for $75 for a curriculum, which I think is extremely valuable. Please share. Let's expand the conversation a little bit because these are difficult topics, and there are people out there that are way more uh, uh, what would be a good word? Just efficacious in these kinds of conversations on certain topics. We'd love to have more guests. We want to have, uh, you know, audience feedback for us to respond to things you disagree with, the things you do agree with, but want clarification on, all that kind of stuff. Our audience is special.
Yeah. Well, it's probably a tight-knit crowd.
I'd be curious to see us all in a room together.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think those are the few groups that we run into: parents, band teachers, other private music teachers, other musicians, that we might have a disagreement with. I don't think a lot of the techniques that, once you translate the learning sequences of music down into what am I going to actually do to implement this, I don't think a lot of teachers would even disagree with doing those things, right? Like, I think we talked about this before, but if you let people who are using decoding keep using it, but you just teach them, you get them to do rhythm patterns.
Yep.
I think you'd get a lot of benefit.
MLT is known. Yeah. Oh, I know MLT. You do rhythm patterns and tonal patterns. And that's the group that does these tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. And it becomes, just that. And
yeah, it becomes 5 minutes of patterns at the start of class, which I don't think is...
Yeah, and it totally demolishes the sequence of vocabularies or the sequence of learning skills, and this, and then the content is, and then how do we really prepare people for improvisation with which, as you mentioned, I don't think most music teachers can.
Yeah, which is it's a funny part of navigating this discussion, and I think you have to take into account who you're talking to. So if you're talking to, I know there are band teachers in this area, and I've had discussions with them who can really play. Like, and it's funny how sensitive my students are to it now. Like, one of my students, he's an amazing piano player, great improviser. He can really swing, and he had a substitute in band one day, and the guy was just improvising over the classical tunes, and it blew his mind. He was like, that guy could really play. So he can spot the musicianship. But I do think you have to take into account who you're talking to when you have these discussions. Because I very rarely hear people who really can play disagree with the fundamental tenet of what MLT is talking about, patterns, vocabularies, oral. We start getting into disagreements once we get into solfege. But I mean, to me, that's sure there are tonal solfege and rhythm solfege systems that may be better for certain uses and all of that. But at that point in the conversation, I start losing interest because you can use your tonal pattern system that you want to use. I have no issue with people who want it, but the sequence is still there. The whole sequence is still there, and yeah, I very rarely hear people disagree with that. Once you unearth what they're actually saying. I mean, Ram Blake is a great example of that. It's just his little book is just like oral will make you an insane musician. Put things in your memory. Don't play them on your instrument until you can sing them. And then the appendix of that book is amazing.
Just one part of the appendix will create an artist instead of somebody just practicing and becoming good.
Yeah. And I think, a part of where we'll wrap this up, but part of where this discussion that we don't often talk about is, we talk a lot about rhythm and tonal patterns, but teaching style is something that we have control over and we have influence. We can influence this in our students, but we often don't choose pieces that make these things generalizable for students. If you only play folk repertoire, if you only play, MLT kind of created stuff that's very tonal patterny and very, very kind of, I don't know the right word I'm looking for, but Eric, you know what I'm
Yep.
talking about. I think you got to play swing music. You got to play Mozart. You got to play these different pieces for people, or they don't generalize style properly. They have a gap in that, and I see that in my students that have enormous listening vocabularies. When they tell me, hey, I made like, or I
Yeah.
improvised, or I created a melody, the style is like
Yeah.
underneath it.
Yesterday for me was
Uh,
Kabalevsky, part of the comedian suite or whatever he called it, and then uh, Ella Fitzgerald and Snarky Puppy.
oh yeah.
and
Yeah, I
and
was
the
I
kids
was
love
I was
all of
listening
it.
to yeah. I was telling you earlier I was listening to like a Dvorak
Yeah.
cello concerto.
Yeah.
It's just like boom. Yeah.
So yeah, we got to keep rounding out our students. We got to keep um, pressing gently among our peers. I feel like I'm pressing among even the music learning theory community a little bit.
Yeah.
But these discussions are worth starting, and then maybe I'll take some of your advice here is like not be committed to changing people's minds because I feel like
Well, I think long
yeah,
range you should be
but
committed to
not
it, but
yeah,
short range it doesn't make sense because it's just
yeah,
basically not going to happen. I mean, even if your argument is delivered with diamond like
yeah,
precision, they very rarely will just change their mind if
yeah. They're not
anybody
going to
will.
make me vote for Trump.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
I apologize to all the people who are
And I mean, and another situation is sometimes you do get parents who are like, no, I want my kid learning to like read music from day one, and they're really almost aggressive about that.
yeah,
Um,
well,
in that situation,
I would say give me a year and then I show them what they can do that they other kids their age wouldn't be able to.
yeah, I've had several different kinds of conversations in that situation. I've had one conversation where I'm like, okay, that's fine, but once a week for half an hour is not a realistic time plan to learn how to actually play and read
Yeah,
music. You know, but the other one is you I just have them start reading rhythm patterns early on if they can handle it, and then the
oh yeah,
parents are usually pretty happy with that. So there's nothing wrong with just reading microbeats and
oh
macrobeats. Like
no,
pretty soon you
no.
can
If
do
you
it.
if you can chant it, there's and you understand the difference between contexts. This is the thing. You've got to be able to look at the page and understand the context before you get started, and that's all you need to do.
That's
And that's what
yeah,
partial
yeah. Like my
synthesis,
my
the traditional
sequence.
way, is just that.
Yeah.
Uh, and frankly, I don't even know if I teach partial synthesis traditionally at all. And by the time I'm done with the verbal association, the
Mm,
kids are over prepared for so much more with reading.
yeah.
All I have to do is show
Yeah.
them familiar songs in notation, just the
Mm.
big beats, or just these few tonal patterns that we know in sequence and familiar.
That's what I do with learning learning to read in duple and triple. I just teach. I do some rhythm patterns, and then I teach like orally, and then I just teach them how to play twinkle and major and minor by rote, and then I just have them sing the rhythm pattern while we play it, and then I just immediately start doing which
Yeah,
one was this? Was this doodaddy or dooday?
yeah, yeah,
And as soon as they can do that, they can read. There's not
yeah. Well, I
there's
go
not like
right
long jump.
to unusual meter, BBNs meter
Yeah,
right away because I want them to see, oh, this kind of note can hold three, and this kind of note can hold two microbeats.
I do. I'm becoming more convinced that using
So
obviously you should learn songs in other meters, but I think turning familiar songs into other meters, man, it expedites this. Like, because it's
I
so
had my
clear.
2.5 and 3-year-old in higher classes yesterday. I said, you know how I let you pick wrong way or right way? Well, today you pick the song. I'm going to play it whatever way I want to, and you have to tell me if it's right or wrong. The kids killed
Yeah,
it. There might have been some
yeah,
confusion, or but it's like, no, that's not the way Twinkle Goes. No, that's not Itsy Bitsy Spider. And I used obviously really familiar songs, even some of my own, but they're taught as much as these other familiar songs, and they know right
yeah,
away that it's the wrong way at 2.5. So you know, maybe
yeah,
not everybody in that class, but certainly by 3 and 4-year-old classes, and yes, no, oh, I
yeah.
don't
I've been
care
doing.
is so. I'm ready to go on beyond that with these kids this year, even with all the 2.5, 3 months off for COVID. I wasn't allowed to teach in these daycares,
Oh yeah.
and they're ready to go. So I'm either become more.
I mean, that's a good sign that it's
I'm
in there if it sticks with it for
yeah,
months.
yeah. I just either become more efficient, or this is a good crop of kids, or probably both, or who knows. But
Yeah,
I'm like, I'm done with my silly words. But I don't know that I want to start teaching 4-year-olds, dominant the submedian. But they're pretty ready for me to go on to the next level. But
that's
I just
cool.
keep what
Yeah,
I'm doing now is just I'm going to do the blues a lot between now and the end of the year, and let them swim in some extra tones, and then also like tritone substitutions. Just let them hear it. Just,
yeah, yeah. The tritone something I'm very
I
interested to
just
see how
put it.
that's gonna
I'm right now.
come out.
I'm just playing with it, and all I'm doing right now is just giving them the oral, and they know it's the jazzy one, and that's it. And I only
Yeah,
do it now really with London Bridge because it just fits better with
sure.
than Mary Had a Little Lamb in terms of the voicings or whatever.
It's funny. I always put like I'll teach people how to play Happy Birthday, like pretty early on, so they can play it for somebody. But when I play it for them, I always put like a half diminished two chord, like near the end, and it's so or a minor
Yeah.
four, however you want to think about it. But man, like people can really hear that.
Oh
Like, and I'm
yeah.
talking about
Yeah,
young
yeah, yeah.
kids,
Oh,
right?
you
Like
hear it.
they
It's just a matter now that you've got it in your oral. Okay, so, well, you got to be able to sing the patterns around it. So they're
exactly,
not getting
yeah.
that quite yet. Um,
No, not yet. But they all tell me,
but
this
I'm
is the
singing the
pretty one.
roots, and
You know
they
what I
know
mean?
that's yeah, and they know that's the jazzy one,
Yeah,
and they can hear the difference between that and 2-5-1 with flat 9 on the 5, and it's just like, okay, that's all I care
yeah,
about
that's
is
cool.
for right now. Until I get enough
Yeah, because doesn't
vocabulary
your
in the with these things, do I want to start label? Well, they're sort of being labeled like the same way I say, well, this is resting tone Ray.
sure,
If they're
yeah,
singing the resting tone, I'd say, well, this is not do. If it sounded like this is resting tone do, it sound like this. Resting tone la, it sound like this. And it gives them all access to all the resting tones, if you call it that, versus jumping in to call them
yeah, and you can
major,
kind of
minor, mixed late and Dorian. I don't use
yeah,
those
you can
words
give
right
things
away.
labels. Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, you can give things labels for
Yep,
recognition, right? So you can,
exactly.
is that the right way or the wrong way,
Yep.
or is that for the happy
Yeah.
birthday? I try not to put the word in their mouth, but they all tell me the half diminished two is the pretty one.
I tell my
But they all
favorite thing.
sing
One of the kids had a
like it's
birthday yesterday, or it was the day before, but I didn't see her the day before. And I said, what's really cool about Happy Birthday? And I go, what's this is? Is that yes or no? No. It's one of the few songs that actually it starts on no, and then it
yeah,
gets to
yeah.
yes, and the kids are like, yeah, we know that song. And it does start on no. Like just that the aha experience. Like I don't know any
The
songs.
Tetris melody in minor, it starts on five in minor, and it's mainly just one, four, and five. It's a really good song to teach.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
Tetris. Yeah, the Tetris
All
melody is
right.
great. So we're talking
We're,
shop a little bit. That's kind of fun. I wanted to
we're
say,
just having a free for all. We were going to
you're
talk
too.
just strictly about these conversations among different colleagues and parents and kids, and how do you
Yeah,
address teaching the basics of components of music learning theory so that people are bought in or have the opportunity to choose out. I don't want to have this kind of experience. I have colleagues who are incredible musicians, and they come to me for a semester or two, and I never see them again. But then I have colleagues that I've had their kids, for 10 years, and it's
Well, I mean, this happened to me, Eric. Like we just posted this pitch letter thing, but like the last year, I think of since I've been thinking about the validity of using pitch letters and when it's appropriate. At first, I was like, man, like maybe I have to leave the Gordon craft because I really don't agree that you should be using tonal solfege the whole way. I don't think it makes sense. And now it's just more nuanced for me anyway. Now it's just like, you know what? I respect the movable dough, and I think you should use it at a certain point. But at some point,
it doesn't. Well, I demonstrated that there's no appropriate solfege for certain functions.
Yeah, I mean, which is not it's not a huge deal. A lot of jazz musicians don't think like I know a lot of jazz musicians if they're going like if they're going like 2-5 to they won't think in C flat.
Yeah.
Right? They'll just think like even if you're in C flat minor, they'll just think 2-5 and B.
Yeah.
Like they'll do stuff like that all the time. So you can kind of throw away the specific verbal associate you use, but yeah, there's anyway, that was an issue where
I'm trying to find a way to bridge from my harmonic learning sequence more into your world of pitch letter names, which I don't have kids old enough to be able to do these, or kids that have that intellectual capacity that could, combines the two.
One thing we didn't talk about in the last episode, maybe I'll just talk about this for a minute here while I have you on. When we talk about using pitch letter names, if you have kids who can use verbal associates in C major and you now want to teach them how to translate those into verbal associates in G major, there's a way to do that theoretically, and then there's a way to just do that with no theory. And I highly recommend that people don't do it theoretically first. So, you teach them to audiate in G major and in C major with pitch letters, and then you just teach them how to change one to the other.
See, with audiation in your voice, there's really no difference, right? Because your voice can audiate, right? Your mind can audiate, and your voice can represent the audiation in a performance that you can actually hear. But then when it comes time to apply that to keyboard or guitar or whatever, just now I want you to play the same thing. Start here, figure it out. And you can show them by rote if they're too frustrated to get them over some humps. But I want to see how much they can figure out on their own. They already know, the tune backwards and forward.
But what a lot of people do is they try to say, well, okay, between C and D, there's a whole step. And they just go down this whole road.
As soon as you do that,
now we go. No, you don't have to do that.
How many letters are there different? How many letters are in between the word I just said? What's S? And you got to go backwards 8.
Not that I don't think there's a time where learning that becomes fine for someone to learn, but it's really not necessary when you're using pitch letters to do that. But yeah. And some instruments are easier to do this on. Like on the guitar, you can literally show somebody like the major scale looks exactly the same. We're just starting somewhere else. But anyways. Okay, well, that'll be all for today. That was a fun conversation, Eric. Till next time.